So let me start things off today with a story to tell you a little bit more about myself and how I came to this work. So I grew up myself in a multicultural family, which was diverse in many ways, in terms of nation, in terms of religion, in terms of race and ethnicity, and also in terms of social class. My father immigrated from Iran, and my mother is Italian American. Her grandparents immigrated here from southern Italy. While my father attended college, only one of my grandparents, my mother's father, had the opportunity to attend high school. Given these cultural and social class differences in my family, I grew up around two important but often clashing ideas about what it means to be a good person and to have a good life. One perspective encouraged me to be an individual and follow my own path. My life should be what I make of it, and I have the opportunity to make choices and shape it as I desire. The other perspective encouraged me to value my family and my roots, that what is important in life is relationships, loyalty, and doing the best you can with what you have. And as I went through college myself and then followed by graduate school, I learned how these different ways of thinking about yourself and acting in the world, what us social psychologists call agency, is shaped by your background and by your life experiences. In particular, your social class background is one of these very important contexts. A couple of years into graduate school studying these issues, Hurricane Katrina hit and devastated New Orleans and its surrounding areas. And at that time, there was a lot of criticism in the media and the larger culture about why so many people stayed in the city after all these warnings about the storm's danger. Many of those who stayed were lower income families who did not have the resources or the connections to get out. And by and large, many of them, contrary to what was in the media, weren't just sitting there waiting for the storm to come. They had elaborate preparation routines that they'd been doing for years. They did the best they could to protect themselves and their families, given their available resources. But given this, why were they being judged so harshly in the larger conversation? And why didn't policymakers and first responders do more to help them meet their needs? So my collaborators and I set out to study how survivors made sense of their experiences and how others, from first responders to the general public, judged them for their supposed choice to stay or leave in the wake of the hurricane. This project really showed me how powerful individualistic narratives and biases are in the wider culture, and what the life and death consequences can be for not understanding how things like income and resources shape how people make sense of their worlds and how to act in them. In other words, their sense of agency. So this experience, and many others like it, is what inspires me and my team at SPARQ to do the work that we do. In particular, let me quickly share our mission with you. Okay, so SPARQ, we like to call ourselves a do tank rather than a think tank, even though of course we are in a university that partners with industry leaders and change makers to reduce social disparities and bridge social divides using insights from behavioral science. And we work in the areas of criminal justice, economic mobility, education, and health. So whether the focus is on the classroom, the workplace, a police department, or the doctor's office, or even out in the community, the SPARQ approach begins with understanding how people experience their environments and how they're treated there. So our team is comprised of social and cultural psychologists who are dedicated to bridging research and practice. And our senior directors, scholars Hazel Rose Marcus and Jennifer Eberhardt, are well known for their work on culture clashes and social divides, as well as racial disparities and bias. And these perspectives ground the approach we take both in our partnerships and in our work. So let me tell you a little bit more about our approach, which we call the person in context. So our person in context approach links people's psychology, what we typically think about as their mindsets, biases, attitudes, and agency, to cultural narratives, institutional norms, practices and policies, and everyday social interactions that make up society. In our approach, changing how people think and what they do requires changing the world around them through improving the interactions they have, the policies they follow, and the narratives they use. This requires identifying key levers for reducing disparities and bridging divides at multiple levels in the social environment, and designing solutions that support positive psychological and behavioral change across these levels. Okay. So now that you have some sense of who we are and what we do, I'd like to talk more about what social psychologists and a place like SPARQ has to do with understanding and addressing poverty. So first, our approach can help people understand and measure the psychological experiences of poverty and mobility. It helps you recognize and see what people are doing and why, as in the case of the Hurricane Katrina survivors I described, and understand their assets and resources as they adapt to their environments. Second, it offers a way to study cultural mismatches and social divides that might come up as you go through poverty and mobility work. For example, people from higher income contexts often have a different sense of who they are and their place in the world from people in lower income contexts. This can be a social divide that shows up in both subtle but also in powerful ways. For example, in terms of how many lay people and first responders harshly criticize those who did not evacuate in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. Third, it can help people identify and assess common mindsets and biases about poverty and inequality. For example, as in the case of Katrina, what we called a choice mindset, or the idea that people's actions were based on their choices, which they should have control over, was very powerful in shaping how lay people and first responders alike judged those who stayed and left. And finally, it offers a way to identify and assess widespread cultural narratives that shape how people think about poverty and inequality, as well as ways to work to institutionalize practices and policies to address it. For example, would the Katrina disaster have been so devastating if emergency and evacuation policies, for example, took better account the perspectives and constraints of lower income residents? Okay, so let's dig next a little more deeply into how higher and lower income contexts can shape and support different kinds of psychological tendencies. So overall, research shows that higher income contexts lead to more focus on the individual and what we call an independent style of agency or way of acting in the world. As you can see in this image up here on the left, there's more focus on each individual person. The spotlight is on them. Given this focus, higher income contexts tend to prioritize the individual. Given the wider availability of resources and options in life, there's a strong emphasis on things like autonomy, choice, control, individual expression. Individual achievement and self-esteem, as well as a strong focus on future planning and goal attainment, is key to being a person and living a good life. Further, people's social networks tend to be large and have looser connections because relationships are seen as freely chosen. So in American society, this way of thinking about people and their place in the world is often seen as the norm or the default, given the powerful cultural narratives about individualism, meritocracy, and the American dream. So how does adapting to and living in lower income contexts shape the self or people's sense of who they are and their identity? And how does this differ from this kind of dominant cultural narrative in the US? So research by our team and others across the social scientists shows that, compared to higher income contexts, lower income contexts are more likely to have the following factors and experiences. So the list I'm going to go through with you quickly right now is probably very familiar to many in this room and who are dedicated to this kind of work, but that isn't actually the case for many practitioners and policymakers. So overall, research shows that lower income contexts lead to interacting more with family and longtime friends, having tighter bonds and more loyalty in your relationships, teaching children to fit in, observe hierarchy, and follow norms, working jobs with less choice and control, having fewer choices among fewer attractive options, and having the higher likelihood of experiencing trauma. It can also lead to worse health outcomes, oops, and also being the target of negative biases, stereotypes, and cultural narratives. Okay. As such, research shows that lower income contexts tend to lead to more focus on relationships and an interdependent style of agency or way of acting in the world. As you can see on the image on the right, there is more focus on the group or the collective. So as you can see, the spotlight is on the larger group. Given this focus, lower income contexts tend to prioritize relationships. Given fewer resources and opportunities for choice and control, what is important is being responsive to others, fulfilling your roles and responsibilities, following norms, and fitting in. There's less emphasis on individual achievement and a stronger focus on the present rather than the future. Further, people's social networks tend to be more localized and tightly knit, and relationships are seen as binding. There's a strong focus on loyalty, empathy, and helping others. People's sense of identity is often focused more around being strong and resilient and doing the best you can with what you have. So taken together, these research insights show how people's social class environments can have a powerful impact on their sense of identity and agency, who they are, and how they think they should act in the world. Now, I want to underscore that one way is not inherently right or wrong. Rather, these are different ways of being that reflect adapting and doing your best to survive and work within the environments that you live in. This leads to different kinds of assets or psychological resources, which can be overlooked if not acknowledged and understood. It's important to note here that the ways in which context shape people's psychological tendencies is inherently malleable. If you change the context or the world around them, their psychological patterns will change accordingly. So they're not fixed or static. They're flexible and adaptable to the world around them. Okay, so these research insights might sound useful or even important to know. Okay, we get it, scholarship research coming out of Stanford, okay. But how do you actually put any of this to work in practice? So next, I'll discuss an example of our work doing so, particularly in the realm of measurement and evaluation, as Jamie mentioned. Okay, so in collaboration with the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty and the Urban Institute, SPARQ joined together with these organizations on a project to shift the framework of understanding mobility from poverty and to help researchers and practitioners incorporate psychological metrics into their evaluation efforts. A key insight from this work is we need to rethink actually how we define mobility from poverty. And as Jamie mentioned, although measures of economic success are foundational to upward mobility, they don't fully capture people's experiences. Just as important as indicators of material wealth are power and autonomy, or people's sense of control over the trajectory of their lives, and being valued in community, their sense of belonging. Our recommended definition of mobility, therefore, has all three of these components. So moving from definitions to measurement, many philanthropies, government agencies, service providers, researchers, and evaluators are familiar with these kinds of standard measures of economic success. For example, people's income or their assets. But if they also begin to measure things like power and autonomy and being valued in community, they could create a meaningful shift in understanding people's experiences as they work toward mobility from poverty, and they can use those insights to better inform policy and practice. So for this project, our organizations collaborated to write a research brief and develop a measurement toolkit for researchers and practitioners. The brief describes our framework for thinking about mobility from poverty and provides background on the psychological constructs that can be measured. The toolkit is an online digital resource that provides complete and usable versions of all the scales or measures that are reviewed in the brief, as well as instructions on how to implement them and use the data that results from them. So the image up here is of the homepage of the toolkit, and the website address is above, but I'm happy, I know it's a lot to kind of take down right now, but I'm happy to share that information with anybody who's interested later. So while there have been many useful psychological measures out there, the majority have been designed and tested with higher income populations in mind. They don't often ask or measure the right kinds of things that show how people from lower income contexts make meaning and draw on their psychological resources and assets. So, with this challenge in mind, we sought out to identify and curate a set of measures that have found to be reliable, valid, and culturally equivalent for lower income populations. So that sounds kind of jargony psychologist stuff, so let me just tell you in plain language what that means. So basically we said, does this capture what we want to measure? Has it been used with people in low income contexts and shown to be effective? Does it predict important outcomes like health, well-being, mobility for people in low income contexts? And will the questions be meaningful and understandable to participants? Will it sound like they're real life, not just some academic scale? So in the toolkit, we created a measure selector, that's in the screen back there, that could be, of all these measures that we found met those criteria. Now again, while there are not nearly good enough measures out there, there are some that are pretty good and can be used. What we really need to do for thinking farther ahead is partner with practitioners who work on these issues on the ground to develop better measures that, often researchers don't all have the insights because they're not there on the ground. But we can talk about that later. All right, so let me talk a little bit more about what these measures look like for those two aspects, power and autonomy, and being valued in community. Okay, so when we talk about power, we mean a person's ability to influence their environment, other people, and their own outcomes. Autonomy is a person's ability to act according to their choices as opposed to others' decisions. So studies with people living on lower incomes suggest that power and autonomy can both drive as well as result from social mobility. So in this toolkit, we offer multiple measures of this idea and other related outcomes like people's sense of agency, their self-efficacy, or sense of control. Now, being valued in community is a person's sense that they belong and are included among family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, and other members of society. A related concept is social capital, which is a web of relationships that can have these kinds of mobility and economic benefits. Being valued in community gives people access to social and material resources, and at the same time, not being valued increases people's sense of isolation or lack of empowerment. So in this toolkit, we offer multiple measures of belonging and related outcomes such as social support, loneliness, and social standing. So here's an example. There we go. Here's an example of a power and autonomy measure. This one assesses whether people have something called a growth versus the fixed mindset. So this measure is an 8-item survey that was developed by psychologist Carol Dweck. If any of you work in education, you might have heard of these ideas. This looks at how much people believe they can change and grow. So it asks questions like, the kind of person someone is something very basic about them and can't be changed very much. People can do things differently, but the important parts of who they are can't really be changed. So if people see these 8 questions, they rate, how much they agree or disagree with them. And research suggests that people who score high on this scale and demonstrate a growth versus a fixed mindset are more readily able to move out of poverty. Next, here is an example of a measure for being valued in community, created by Okay, we got it. Created by health psychologist Nancy Adler. The technical name for this is the MacArthur Scale of Subjective Social Status. That's a mouthful. But it's a single item measure that assesses a person's perceived rank relative to others in their group. So while people in lower income contexts might not have many material resources, they could, for example, be a leader in their neighborhood or in their community or in their church and have status that way. So being able to capture how people might have different kinds of status in their life can help explain why some people might do better than others in poverty and mobility efforts. So basically there's different kinds of ways you can set up the scale, but basically you ask people to rank themselves relative to others who might be better off or worse off, and then they see this ladder image and they place where they believe they're standing to be. And so research shows that people who score higher on this scale tend to feel like they have better standing in their community, and it's also been found to predict better levels of health and well-being. Okay, so before I end with a couple of ideas that Spark and Circles have been discussing around a collaboration, let me sum up with just a couple of key points. So first, we've seen that working on issues of poverty and mobility requires recognizing that people involved in these efforts are often coming to it with different kinds of understandings of who they are and their place in the world, different understandings of their identity and agency. So working to support people in their mobility journey will require harnessing and understanding this. Second, while economic indicators are of course important to use in evaluation efforts, so are more psychologically oriented concepts like power and autonomy and belonging in community. These ideas have been well researched, and there are a number of good measures out there that you can incorporate into your evaluation efforts. Finally, incorporating a social psychological perspective into poverty and mobility work can be useful for identifying how things like mindsets and cultural narratives can both help and also hinder efforts to make a difference both within and across communities. So in conclusion, I'll leave you with a couple of ideas that Spark and Circles have been discussing around collaboration, and I look forward to talking about other options and ideas with all of you over the next few days. So one area of work could be around partnering to do more to recognize, measure, and harness the many psychological resources and assets that Circle leaders, allies, and program staff bring to their work. How might we work together on increasing empowerment and expanding their sense of what's possible? Okay, another area of work could be around continuing to better understand and foster the many cross-class interactions that take place in Circle's work. Is there more we can do to help bridge divides in people's perspective and experiences and help them learn from one another even more effectively? Yet another area of work we have discussed is measuring and tracking things like mindset shifts, community changes, and possibly even narrative changes in chapters, locations, and hubs. And this will require a multi level strategy incorporating various kinds of social science assessment methods at these different levels. Okay, also, as Jamie mentioned, in terms of future directions, we could also collaborate together more to explore how the QUESA model is working in diverse communities and how it might be tailored given different communities' perspectives and needs, building on the already great work going on there. Okay, and we could also work together to consider how things like wider social and political issues are affecting people's experiences in their local communities and with the program. All right, so that's it for now. Thanks so much for listening, learning more about Spark and the work that we do, and I look forward to learning more from all of you and talking more as well. Thank you.